I suppose the question I would have is, why would you do anything else? In the sense that if you can be effective using fewer means, why would you do more? And for me, the idea of minimalism, I think, is based on two core ideas. And one is that people really do have better things to do than to spend time talking to me in therapy. That life is very much for living rather than for talking about. So if we can have people out living their lives, getting on with them, that for me is always going to be better than people coming to talk to me about it. And the other aspect of minimalism, I think, is just thinking about what's the least that we can do that is associated nonetheless with a good outcome. Because if we can centre the change on the client's own best ways of doing things, then it's massively more likely at the end of the piece of work that what the client's going to say to us is, I did it myself. And the more that clients at the end of a piece of work can say, I did it myself, the more that seems to be associated with change. The more the client believes that they made the change, the more they're likely to believe that they can maintain the change. So actually minimalism, I think, works in all sorts of different levels. Look, the thing I think that we actually have to learn, and in some ways I think it's the most difficult thing to learn, is that we really, really have to trust the client. Because when we train as therapists, I think that very often we're almost trained not to trust the client. That somehow in our professional trainings there's this idea, however subtly it's communicated, that sort of we know better. And the way that, look, I can remember from my training that idea turned up was that I remember sitting in clinical discussions, and we used to love clinical discussions. You know, it was the high point of our week, having a wonderful clinical discussion in which we could begin to develop hypotheses about what might be going on. But very quickly, as you listened to these clinical discussions, what we began to hear were professionals talking about what was really going on. So what's really going on? And then after a bit, I can remember sitting there and the more experienced members of the clinic would start talking about what was really, really going on. And then in the clinic I worked with, there was one particular guy who was a worldwide expert in his field. And I have to say that I never understood a thing he said. But what he talked about was what was really, really, really going on. And of course, our ideas about what was really going on depended on our theories. Our theories have changed because every theory of change has different ideas about what's really going on. So we all differed at some level in terms of what we thought. But implicitly, what we all agreed was that anyway, the client couldn't possibly know. And so in order to be minimal, I actually think we have to learn to trust our client. And when we ask the client, so what are your best hopes from our talking together? We actually have to believe the answer, rather than sitting there, as it were, second guessing the client. Yeah, they're saying that, but what they should really be saying is this. So what the client says they want is what they want, and we need to take it seriously. Now, in addition, trusting the client involves us, I think, in taking very seriously the idea that our client's own ideas about how to move forward and how to resolve issues is likely to be the best idea. And so again, rather than thinking that I have ideas, I know how the client should tackle this, if I'm trusting my client, I'm going to become really, really curious about the client's own best way. And as soon as we start getting curious about the client's own best way, then the work is also likely to be less intrusive and more centralized on the client. In my definition, more minimal. in that sense. So trust, I think, is central to what we need to achieve in order to develop this more minimalistic approach to our work with people. There are all sorts of ways that we can start a therapeutic conversation. And I guess a very characteristic way, a typical way that makes obvious sense, is to ask people, what brings you here? Obvious. That's what you would ask, surely. But as soon as you start asking people what brings you here, the client is likely to step into a problem-dominated conversation. And so we're asking the client, we're meeting the client through a problem description. So we'll begin to have certain ideas about the client as we listen to them talk about their problem. An alternative question that of course we could ask is again, how could I help you? A question that actually is more outcome focused and to that extent might be more useful, but is also very centered on the centrality of the worker rather than the power of the client. Whereas if we ask people, so what are your best hopes from our talking together? First of all, it centers the client actually in the description. And it invites the client to start hoping. And I think hope's important. I think that people need to be able to hope to engage in the process of change. And so connecting people up with what their hopes are, I think is a useful place to start. And again, as soon as we start talking to people about, what their best hopes are, they'll immediately start thinking about the preferred future they want to build, rather than inevitably talking to us about the problems that are constraining them or restricting them or holding them back in some way. So just starting with, what are your best hopes from our talking together? How will you know that our talking together has been useful? I mean, interestingly, we spent some time talking about the particular words that you can use. And one of the things we were thinking about was, which question works better? What are your best hopes for our talking together? Or what are your best hopes from our talking together? And what we noticed was there was a subtle difference. That when we asked people, what are your best hopes for our talking together? People were more likely to give us answers that focused on what happened in the therapy. Whereas as soon as we started asking people, what are your best hopes from our talking together? People started talking about differences that resided out in their lives rather than in the therapeutic process. And that seemed to be associated with a more direct line towards the future that people wanted. When they describe in detail the future they want, the first thing is that very, very typically what people begin to notice is that they're already doing small parts of it. And so, people say, maybe I'll be saying no to my friends rather than always going along with them. I could at that point say, tell me about times you do already do that. But not unusually, people will pause and say, I do that sometimes. So as we begin to invite people to talk about the future they do want, then of course they also begin to notice the bits of it they've already got. And what we've noticed is that as people describe those futures that they want for themselves, that it seems to be associated with a greater chance of people going away and doing something useful. Now, exactly why that's the case, we could start developing all sorts of theories. And people do have a whole host of different theories about why that might be useful. What we know is that doing it seems to be more associated with people coming back for follow-up sessions when we ask them what's been better and describing things that are better. So it seems to be associated with change at a very pragmatic level. Look, I think one of the changes that you can see in solution focus is to do with endings, how you end. And if you look at the work of Steve DeShazer, I mean, it's very, very interesting. And this would be true right until the end of his therapeutic life. That Steve would be asking people questions about the future they wanted and what they were already doing that was working for them. And then towards the end of a session, you could see him beginning to start thinking, so what task am I going to give? And at the point that he started thinking, what task am I going to give, you saw the nature of the questions begin to change. And suddenly you could see him wanting to know things, wanting to hear things, wanting to understand things in order to shape a task. And that sort of talking and listening is different and was different from the talking during the body of the session. And I guess that what we began to do, first of all, there were a number of steps. The first thing was that we really disliked the name task or homework. And partly that's just because of the implications of the name. You know, if we think about homework, after all, what is the context of homework? The context of homework is a teacher gives homework to a pupil. So at once what you have there is an implied hierarchical relationship. And after all, if you begin to think about what happens when a pupil doesn't do their homework, they get into trouble. You know, in the English schools, historically and traditionally, the pupil who didn't do homework would get a detention. Now, obviously, you can't give someone a detention in therapy. You can't say to the person who comes in and says, you know, sorry, I didn't do the homework. Right, today's session is going to be 90 minutes, not 60 minutes. You can't do that. But the way that people get into trouble therapeutically, if they don't do their homework, is the way the therapist begins to think about them. And the risk is that if we give someone homework, we begin to have the idea the person's meant to do it. And if they don't do it, we start changing the way we think about people. And the way we start thinking about people is, aha, maybe this person's not motivated. Maybe this person's resistant. Maybe this person doesn't want to change. And of course, that therapeutically is trouble. Because as soon as the therapist starts thinking that about us, then actually change is less likely. As soon as the therapist starts stepping into critical thinking about the client, it's harder for the therapist to collaborate with us, to cooperate with us, and change, the possibility of change becomes restricted. So we started not liking the words. And the first step was towards, we started offering people suggestions. Now, as soon as we start thinking about offering someone a suggestion, then look, the idea we had was that people would use the suggestion if the suggestion was useful. But if it wasn't a very good suggestion, what do people do with not very good suggestions? They ignore them. So they don't do anything with them. So the first step away from tasks and homework, was the idea that we just offered suggestions. And the suggestions that we offered were pretty well always the same. So what we would say to people is, look, before we meet next time, we've got a suggestion for you. What we'd like to suggest is that you just watch out for change. And I'll ask you about it next time. And then just recently, I started noticing myself changing the ends of sessions. And rather than offering a suggestion, what I started offering people was what you could think of, it's a bit of an odd phrase, but as a benevolent warning. And the benevolent warning that I now give people is I say to people, look, if you decide to come back, let me warn you now. The first question I'm going to ask you when you come back is what's been better. So if you start watching out for it now, it'll probably make the next session easier for you. And so people smile and laugh and off they go. I haven't told them what to do, I've just told them that that's going to be the first question. And if they happen to start watching out for it, they'll make the next session easier for themselves. So we've moved away from tasks, we've moved away from homework. In my practice, I've moved away from suggestions to the idea of just a benevolent warning, and what people do with it is entirely up to them. Well, look, the phrase leaving no footprints in the client's life, obviously comes from Insu Kim Berg. It's an impossible aspiration. As soon as we've met someone, we've left footprints in their life. But I think that what it might be useful to try to ensure is that those footprints are as light as possible in people's lives. And for me, the reason it's important is that I'm interested in people having that experience of we did it ourselves. The more that people have that idea we did it ourselves, I think it's all the more likely that people really will believe that they can maintain it themselves. What I don't want, and at the end of a piece of work, sometimes I fail. And people say to me something like, "Evan, you were terrific. I couldn't have done that without you." And obviously we're all human. And when we hear someone saying, "Evan, you were terrific. I couldn't have done it without you," there's a little bit of your heart that glows at that moment. It's hard not to. But I've taught myself to see it as worrying feedback. If they couldn't do it without me, can they maintain it without me? And so what I'll tend to do these days is, you have to be gracious. You don't throw people's compliments back in their faces, saying, "Don't say that, it's bad feedback." Of course not. You have to be nice, you have to be polite. And so I'll say, "Look, I'm delighted that the work we've done has been of use to you. I'm really, really pleased. However, I have to say, there are people who come here who don't change. So what is it that you might have done that's been associated with building these changes in your life?" And so I'm always wanting to turn the credit back to the person who's come to the session. In that sense, so they take the credit away from the therapy. I do genuinely believe that, although in any one case we can't possibly know, but nonetheless, many of the clients I work with, credit is more useful to them than it is to me. I was doing a project in a big mental health trust in the south of London, actually South London's biggest mental health trust. And one of the groups of people I was working with were community psychiatric nurses. And in the UK, this is a group of people, and one of the things that they do is to work with people who are living with mental health problems in the community, some of whom they have known for a long time. And we were just talking about medication and what we thought about medication and how you could ask solution-focused questions around medication. And what they were interested in trying to achieve was, if you like, a more interactive framing, interactional framing around medication. And the question that they came up with was asking people, when they were put on medication, asking people the question, how could you know that you are making the very best use of the opportunity that the medication offers you? So now the medication is framed as an opportunity that people are invited to do something with. So rather than the idea that they take the medication, that's done, they're finished. Swallow the pill, that's it. The injection, you're finished. Actually, the medication becomes a window of opportunity that the client is invited to make the best of. And I was curious about that question and how it would work. The CPNs, the community psychiatric nurses who used it, loved the question and said that it really, really made a difference in their work with the people they worked with. And again, when people come back and, you say, so what's been better? And they say, well, things have been great. And then you say, well, how do you explain it? And they say, well, I've changed my medication. We can then again ask, well, what percentage of the change would you put down to the medication? And what percentage of the change would you actually accept responsibility for yourself? And what they noticed was that very, very few people said 100% the medication, 0% for them. So even if it was 95% for the medication, 5% for them, the nurses would get very interested in the 5%. So tell me more about the 5%. What have you done to contribute to these changes working out for you? So we can actually frame medication in a more interactional way, in a way that invites the client to own more of the difference and to take responsibility for it, I think. If a client left a session with me and their feedback to their referrer was, this guy wasn't interested in me, he didn't take me seriously, I would be horrified by that. I'd be really upset and appalled by that. And I genuinely don't think that that's the experience that people have. Obviously, when we ask people, so what are your best hopes from our talking together, we're not asking them about the problem, and that's true. But very often what people begin to do is they begin to interconnect a preferred future description or a best hopes description with a problem description. So people will start saying to us, well, I've been feeling really horrible recently, so I suppose I'd be feeling better. And the bit of that answer that I'm going to pick up would not be, I've been feeling really horrible recently, so I say, so how would you know you were feeling better? And they say, well, I've hardly been going out recently, so I suppose I'd be going out more often. I'd have more energy. I'd be answering the phone. And as people begin to describe it, what I think people know is that actually, as they're telling us about the preferred future, they're also in a curious way talking to us about the problem. Because the flip side, the other side, the opposite of every preferred future description is the problem. The person who says, I want to be more confident, knows that they've just told us that they're not feeling very confident right now. The person who says, I want to have a better relationship with my child, knows at another level that they've just told us their relationship with their child's not great right now. When we say, how will you know your relationship with your child's improving? And they say, he'll be listening to me, people realise that what they've just said is, my child doesn't listen to me right now. So as we begin to build up a really, really detailed picture of the future that people want, the other side of that actually is that people are describing in operational detail the nature of the problem. What is the problem that they bring? And I think people get that. And I think that people get it at some level probably better than we professionals do. I think they understand it. But if people are going to tell us about the problem, always my preference would be for people to tell us about the problem in what I would think of as the language of aspiration, rather than the language of limitation and restriction. I genuinely don't think it's useful for people to talk over and over and over about the problem, the nature of the problem. Because I think what happens is that as people tell their problem story over and over and over, then the nature of the story begins to rigidify. And what I think happens is that people begin to believe that the problem story that they're telling us is, look, this is going to be a difficult word to use, but is true. And I don't mean that it's not true when they tell us, But when people tell us their problem story, it is only one of their available stories. And as they tell that story, what they tend to leave out of their problem story are actually the times it's a little bit better. The times that things were a little bit better. The times that they cope a little bit better. The times they manage better. So people edit all that stuff out of the story they tell us when they're telling their problem story. And so people end up repeatedly telling a story that doesn't do them justice. A story that from which all the possibilities have been removed. And actually, goodness, this is a bit strong. But actually, I don't think it's ethical to do that. I think it's unethical to allow someone, or certainly, look, I would say to collude with someone, telling their problem story over and over and over in a way that doesn't do them justice. Now, obviously, if someone has never told their problem story before, the first time, and they're telling their story of abuse, they've never told it before, then look, I'm going to listen respectfully. I'm not going to invite them to tell me more. I'm not going to amplify the story. I'm not going to say, so how did that make you feel, or how did that impact on you? But I'm going to listen. And as I'm listening, I'm going to be acknowledging, I hope, and I'm going to be inviting people to think about how they survived those experiences. How did you get through? How did you get by? That sounds like you've lived through a really tough time. Am I right? Yes. So how on earth did you get through that time? How did you manage? How did you survive? And so I'll hear people's stories. I'm not going to detain them in their stories. And I'm not going to keep them stuck in those problem stories. But they will tell me their story. But what I don't think is okay is to allow people to tell a self-limiting story over and over again in such a way that change, in my view, becomes less likely and the problem becomes bigger. So I think people do know that they're being acknowledged. And I certainly would be horrified if someone felt they weren't being taken seriously, as I'm asking them in detail about the life they want to build. I trained initially as a systemic psychotherapist, a family therapist, well, a social worker first of all. And working as a social worker, I worked a great deal with families. And then I trained as a systemic psychotherapist. And part of the reason why systemic psychotherapy made absolute sense to me was because as a social worker, I'd always worked with families. And I understood, I think, that if change is going to be maintained, again, if the whole system makes changes, then it's easier for the change to be sustained than if just one person makes changes. And so that seemed a very obvious idea. And then some years ago, I remember our friend Ben Furman coming to London, and one of the phrases that he used that's always stayed with me, and actually I always credit him for, is the idea of sharing credit. That when people begin to make changes, I think that it's really important not just for them to take the credit for those changes rather than the worker or professionals or medication somehow taking the credit for those changes, but also to share the credit with those around them. And so asking the question, who else was helpful to you in making these changes, and do they know how helpful they were? One of the really nice things I'm married to Denise Youssef, who works a great deal with children. And one of the things that she does when she works with children in schools is to, at the ends of sessions very often, is to give them credit cards. And of course, children love the idea of credit cards, but these aren't the sorts of credit cards that most of us are familiar with. This is a card that the child fills in to say thank you to someone in their life. So perhaps to their teacher, thank you very much for helping me to learn to concentrate, and this is what you did. And they would then be invited to give the credit card to the person who actually had helped them. And what is so interesting is that in school systems, teachers never throw away these credit cards. You can see in staff rooms whole walls of credit cards stuck up on the wall. And as soon as the child has said thank you to the teacher, thank you for doing this, the likelihood that the teacher will do it again and keep doing it is hugely enhanced. It's like when we give someone a compliment. I really like that shirt you're wearing, Ben. Look, the person is massively more likely. We could actually count the frequency of shirt wearing before the compliment and after the compliment. You give people a compliment, if they like you, they'll wear that shirt more often. And in the same way, if we give someone a compliment about what they've done that's worked, it's likely that they'll do more of what they've been credited for. So sharing credit in organizations, in teams, in systems, I think works really, really well and makes a difference and helps to embed changes within systems. It's a sort of a deprofessionalization of mental health. I think that a whole group of professions have, to some extent, including mine, I'm not excluding mine, have colonized mental health and have, to some extent, turned it into an industry. And what I would like to see at all sorts of levels, first of all, and most importantly, how could we create communities which produce less distress? How could you create communities that produce less distress? How can you create contexts where people are more likely to do themselves justice, to feel they can contribute, to feel they can feel valued, that they can play their part in those communities? So at that level, how can we do that? And then, of course, there are always going to be times when things go wrong in people's lives. That's just also the nature of things. And I suppose what I'm interested in are developing interventions that centralize the client's own perspective and client's own best ways of moving forward, so that people can feel that they can own their own changes. To work with, there are a lot of organisations in the UK certainly, where service users, ex-users of services, can become part of supporting other people to move through crisis. And so what we have is a sort of deprofessionalisation of the interventions. And I think for me that's always going to be a better intervention when people are talking with other people who've been through the same sorts of experiences that they've had and found their ways through and find their own ways through those sorts of experiences in those conversations with other people who've had the same sorts of experiences. And then at a third level, if that's not going to be okay, how can we develop services where the professional begins to get interested in the client's own unique ways of finding, look, I don't very much like the word solutions, but nonetheless, their own solutions to solving the issues and the difficulties that are facing them, rather than the professional, as it were, imposing perhaps their solutions on the client and somehow assuming that they know best what clients should do. So, look, it's a very old-fashioned word now that perhaps we don't use quite as much as we did. But how can we work in ways that both centralise and empower the client to find their own best way forward in a way that fits them and their own values and beliefs and identity, rather than somehow thinking that we have the best ways forward. So for me, that would be, I think, the sort of way forward that I'd like to see. And what that involves is all sorts of communal changes, I think, in order, changes at the level of politics, changes at the level of communities and how they operate. And those probably would be much more powerful than anything that I could ever do with the small numbers of clients that I work with.